The Spanish Civil War has sometimes been called the proving ground for the armies of the Second World War. In its own way, the fighting in Spain was a global conflict. The Soviet Union, Italy and Germany all sent major contingents to the peninsula. We left off last week with a look at the military campaigns of the Red Army in the Far East and Finland. This week we will continue our series of Prelude episodes before our weekly World War II Eastern Front series. We will get to see how involvement in the Spanish Civil War left its mark on the Wehrmacht and the Red Army. Let's begin with some background of the conflict. This series dives deep into complex and often sensitive historical topics that may not always align with YouTube's guidelines, so your support is essential. By becoming a member or patron, you're helping keep this project alive and ensuring we can continue delivering high-quality content to our viewers without worrying about demonetization. Our members and patrons have early access to the next 6 episodes. Become one by pressing the join button under the video or via the links in the description and pinned comment, and gain access to future Eastern Front videos and 200 other exclusive episodes. In the 6 years before the Spanish Civil War began in 1936, Spain had 3 military dictators and 1 failed revolution. The society of the country was divided along partisan lines that did little for a sense of national unity. The attempted revolution of 1933 was conducted primarily under the auspices of the extreme left-wing parties in response to the electoral victory of the right-wing politicos. Though this revolution was initially successful in many areas of the country, it was eventually put down with some difficulties. Several of the leaders of the Spanish army began to see the left-wing parties as harbingers of insecurity and instability that would lead to the dissolution of the troubled country. This view played into the hands of agitators in the army and government. The agitators were not monolithic in their politics, but instead represented a wide range of right-wing philosophies, including fascism, Catholic supremacists, and monarchists of all stripes. In the election of 1936, the left parties won, and some disorder ensued. This was partially the fault of the victorious party's supporters. Many of them were overzealous in their celebrations, and took to burning and looting. The new government struggled with the decision to restore order, as they did not want to be seen crushing their own supporters in the street. At the same time, they knew that they needed the military support, both to restore order and to govern effectively. Within weeks of the election and the ensuing chaos, a national conspiracy had started to form. General Emilio Mola was the initial leader of the group. He shared this role with General Francisco Franco, General José Sanjurjo, and General Manuel Godet. These men formed the leadership core of the nationalists in the coming civil war, in addition to having planned the initial coup. That coup was launched in the early morning hours of the 18th of July. Unfortunately for the conspirators, within days it was clear that the coup had failed. They decided not to give in and organized military resistance to the government. The Spanish Civil War had begun. The war would last until 1939 and became a focal point for all those involved in the Second World War. Within months, hundreds of thousands of volunteers flocked to the colors of both sides. These volunteers came from all corners of the earth and walks of life. Near the end of 1936, organized military units began to work inside the country. The Germans were the first to send military aid in meaningful numbers. This support started from the earliest days of the attempted coup. Starting about the 29th of July, the freshly minted Luftwaffe began transporting troops and materiel from the nationalist base of operations in Morocco to the controlled territory in Spain. Over the next 2 weeks, they would bring at least 10,000 of Franco's best troops over from the Army of Africa, which had been under his command when the war broke out. More men and equipment had been planned to come across the Straits of Gibraltar, but the majority of the small Spanish navy had stayed loyal to the Republican government. To counter this, Hitler dispatched the Panzerschiffs Deutschland and Admiral Scheer to escort Franco's transports. These were powerful ships that outgunned anything the Spanish navy could bring to bear, even before the defection of her best ship, the Canarias. There was the matter of the Spanish navy's dreadnoughts, but these were not modern battleships. The Hispana and the Jaime I were older pre-World War I designs that had never been properly modernized. These ships were outclassed by the Panzerschiffs. The German cruisers proved to be effective deterrents during the early transfers across the Strait of Gibraltar. Benito Mussolini was eager to participate in the struggle as well, hoping to use the conflict as a way to expand Italian influence in the Mediterranean and demonstrate the growing power of his military. He ordered 90 aircraft to be sent to the nationalist forces in the first weeks of the war. though these took somewhat longer than that to be delivered. The airlift, conducted by the Luftwaffe of Franco's troops, was partially manned by Italian pilots flying their own transports. Additional Italian naval units participated in the ongoing convoy escort operations. The United Kingdom was uneasy about the leftist Republican government, and many of its leaders privately supported the nationalist cause. There was tension enough in the British Empire without the additional stress of a civil war causing friction in the Mediterranean, as well as potentially upsetting the fragile balance of power in Europe. They almost immediately set out to forge a non-intervention pact among the world powers. It took weeks of diplomatic maneuvering. Eventually, the French, Germans, Italians, Soviets, the United States, and the lesser powers like Belgium and Czechoslovakia agreed to a non-intervention agreement and a committee of representatives from the various powers to ensure compliance. This proved to be little more than a farce. The League of Nations was less than useless at preventing blatant disregard for this agreement. Hitler and Mussolini took full advantage of the passivity of the other powers and worked to maximize the effect of their aggressive support of the nationalists. As weeks turned into months, German and Italian support grew to levels far beyond what General Franco had asked for in the opening days of the coup attempt. The Germans formed the Condor Legion, which featured the Luftwaffe's latest and greatest weapons. The U-52 transport was the workhorse of the Legion. This plane had been developed from a civilian plane that worked as an airliner and freight plane. It was adopted for military use and would go on to become one of the iconic planes of the Wehrmacht's campaigns of domination across Europe and Africa. Another Junkers design was also to make its debut in the skies over Spain, the U-87 Stuka. Heinkel also had its infamous He-111 put into service, attacking Republican airfields and terror-bombing civilians, most notably in Guernica. The last type to make its appearance that we will discuss is the Bf-109. This fighter would go on to become the second most produced military aircraft of all time. Around 30,000 were built during its production run. The Condor Legion never had more than a few squadrons of operational planes. However, their effect on the course of the war was outsized due to the relative poverty of the air arm on both sides. The Republican government never fielded anything more than a complete hodgepodge of types from all over the world. This reduced the potential effectiveness of the Air Force as their logistics, training, and actual capabilities remained fractured until the end. The Germans also sent officers from each branch of the Wehrmacht, not just to observe and advise the nationalist forces, but to learn from their mistakes as well. The Luftwaffe was the largest contributor of forces in the Condor Legion, and therefore received the largest share of advisor assignments. This included the command which went to Field Marshal Hugo Speer, whose most notable later command would be defending occupied Europe from the combined bomber offensive. The primary analysis of the fighting was put under General Helmut Wilberg. The general was known as a talented theorist and an able commander. Among his staff were several notable names, including future field marshals and generals. Lieutenant General Adolf Galland served as squadron commander and would eventually be credited with 104 kills in the World War. Field Marshal Wolfram von Richthofen served as the Chief of Staff and later commander of the Legion in Spain. During this time, he gained some notoriety for the planning and execution of the bombing of Guernica. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma commanded the small ground combat element of the Condor Legion. The ground combat troops of the Condor Legion were relatively small and had little effect on the outcome of the war. When the Legion was pulled out, only some 400 tank crew badges were awarded for the entirety of the campaign. There were certainly not 400 tank crews present at any one time in Spain under the Condor Legion. This would have represented an enormous contribution far beyond anything Hitler would have been prepared to allow at that time. 400 Panzer Is would need to be crewed by 800 men, with 2 each, and Panzer IIs required 3 men each. This does not even include the men required for repair and maintenance. At any rate, the Condor Legion's assistance was dwarfed by the Italian contribution. At its peak, the Corpo Truppe Volontarie had more than 750 planes and 75,000 men in Spain fighting for Franco. The Italians were consistently the strongest supporter of either side in the Spanish Civil War and worked hard to ensure Franco's victory. On the other side, the Republicans struggled to get any support from other nations. The French sent a few planes in the early days, but nothing more due to political tensions in Paris. The British and the Americans were committed to the Non-Intervention Committee. Individuals from across the world had volunteered, but they brought with them little material support. The Soviet Union officially signed on to the Non-Intervention Agreement, but unofficially sent significant aid to the Republican forces. Stalin walked a fine line in flouting the agreement openly as he tried to keep diplomatic connections with France and Britain as a means of containing Hitler. By October of 1936, Stalin had sent Jan Berzin to take command of the Red Army's small but growing advisory mission in Spain. Berzin was a highly placed military intelligence officer, and it is somewhat telling of the nature of Stalin's plan that a general was not sent instead. One of the primary concerns at this point was the internal security of the military. Overseas adventures with independent military commands and the opportunity to fraternize with politically unreliable foreigners were not desirable to the generals of the Red Army. Stalin was just beginning his Great Purge, and Berzin would fall victim to it himself in 1937. The Soviets demanded that the Republican forces pay for the equipment they were being shipped, and to this order, the country's gold reserves were shipped to Moscow. Nominally, this was for safekeeping. Reality dictated otherwise. The Soviets drew on this reserve to pay for the equipment being sent, and did so using exchange rates that benefited Moscow above all other considerations. The Germans and Italians gave most of their assistance essentially pro bono or for future concessions, which Franco was keen to deliver. The Soviet Union upped the ante in the last months of 1936, delivering much equipment and personnel to Spain. Numbers are hard to come by, but in these first months, the Soviets had a much larger contribution than either of the fascist dictators. This balance did not hold, however, and the Soviets would eventually lag in their contribution. The aid was a mixed bag for the Republicans. Some of the equipment was excellent and outperformed much of the German and Italian aid. The Soviet T-26 tank was one of these examples and consistently bested its counterparts in nationalist service. However, in the air, things were less clear. In the early days, the Polikarpov I-16 dominated the first fascist fighters, the Heinkel He-51 and the Arado R-65. However, these were obsolete biplanes, and the newer Messerschmitt Bf-109s gave the stubby Polikarpov a run for its money. All told, the Republicans received something like 680 planes from the Soviet Union and manufactured 250 more using Soviet designs. The Soviet contribution varied from year to year according to political issues in Moscow, as Stalin carried out his purges and had concerns over alienating potential allies. By 1938, Stalin is purported to have understood the consequences of a Republican victory as such that the Soviet Union would be isolated from Europe and the Allies would work with Hitler and Mussolini to strengthen the anti-Comintern Pact. Whether this was actually likely as an outcome is irrelevant if Stalin shaped his policies around these possibilities. One of the most persistent myths of foreign involvement in the Spanish Civil War is that it was a proving ground for the combined arms tactics that would be used in the Second World War. This misconception falls apart under any serious examination. At no point were there enough tanks on either side that could be concentrated into massed maneuver elements, the likes of which the world would see in the French and German armoured divisions of 1940. Also, the entire concept of the Blitzkrieg was never a formal doctrine of the Wehrmacht, as we have seen in our videos exploring the interwar development of that force. General Franco was not a good stand-in for the Wehrmacht's conception of the ideal general. He was methodical, slow, and was much too involved in politics and diplomatic outcomes for the more decisive and insular German officer corps. German officers of the Heer gave him little support, and sometimes actively lobbied against him to Hitler. The Republican forces never had the discipline or unity of command the Red Army would employ to such strong effect in the last years of the Second World War. They did have to deal with the internecine conflicts with political forces that plagued operations in Spain and throughout the coming war. On the whole, neither the German Heer nor the Red Army was terribly interested in the conflict in Spain. Many of the leading lights saw it as a distraction at best and a potential career ender at worst. On this front, the lessons learned tended to be technical evaluations of the equipment sent when faced with that of likely opponents. Stalin and Hitler both intentionally limited their military involvement in the war, rightly seeing it as a political liability and a drain on the land forces of their regimes. Both dictators were adamant that a general war was coming to the continent, and that the disposition of Spain would not make a difference. On the other hand, if thousands of tanks and planes were thrown away just as the army was trying to expand, then these preparations would be derailed. And this derailment might make the difference in any coming war. Next week, we'll go over the pre-war relationships of the German and Soviet dictatorships. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the prelude to the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share this video. It helps immensely. We have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.